Johnny Cash, the man in black, was loved for his honesty, his faith, and the storm in his voice that spoke for the broken and the forgotten. To millions, he was forgiveness in human form, but behind those dark eyes lay anger that never faded. He was betrayed, mocked, and wounded by men he once stood shoulder to shoulder with. And at 71, frail, struggling to breathe, staring at the end of his life, Cash decided to do something he had never done before. He wrote down the names of 7 musicians, not friends, not heroes, enemies, men he could never forgive, no matter how many prayers he sang. For decades, he had kept the truth locked away, allowing the world to see only the music, not the grudges. But before the light went out, Johnny Cash chose to let it spill, leaving behind a list that shook Nashville and rewrote the story of his final years. These are the 7 musicians Johnny Cash hated most, and the reasons will leave you stunned. Johnny Cash was never a man who played politics in music. From the very beginning, he walked into Nashville like a storm no one could control. He was the son of Arkansas sharecroppers, a man who knew poverty, pain, and loss before he ever knew fame. When he sang, it was not just melody. It was testimony. But with that honesty came something else, a raw edge that refused to hide his contempt for betrayal. The country music business in the 1950s and 60s was ruthless, filled with backroom deals, double crosses, and artists forced into silence if they wanted to survive. Johnny Cash could not be silenced. He fought record executives who wanted to box him in. He argued with radio stations that tried to censor his songs about prisoners, outlaws, and addicts. He even walked into the White House staring Richard Nixon in the eye and refusing to play the patriotic songs Nixon requested. Cash was not afraid of enemies. But what shocked the world was that many of those enemies were not politicians or businessmen, they were fellow musicians. To understand why Cash's list carried such weight, you have to understand the era he came from. He was signed to Sun Records in Memphis, alongside Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins. Together they became known as the $1 Million Quartet, a group of Southern boys who would reshape American music forever. But even in those early days, tensions simmered. Fame was a battlefield, and every handshake hid a rivalry. Cash was quiet compared to Jerry Lee's fire or Elvis's charisma, but he carried himself like a man who demanded respect. And when he didn't get it, he never forgot. As his career grew, so did his battles. He fought with the Grand Ole Opry when they banned him for smashing stage lights during a drunken performance. He fought with Columbia Records when they tried to polish his outlaw image into something marketable. And he fought with other artists when they mocked his struggles with pills, belittled his faith, or disrespected his beloved wife, June Carter. To Cash, loyalty was sacred. Anyone who broke that code was not just a rival, they were an enemy. By the late 1990s, Cash's body was failing. Heart disease and diabetes left him weak, his once thunderous baritone now ragged with pain. Yet even as his health collapsed, his spirit remained sharp. He began reflecting on his life, his music, and the people who shaped both. It was during these late nights surrounded by medication bottles, stacks of letters and memories that burned brighter than fire, that Cash finally confronted the bitterness he had carried for decades. Friends say he began making lists, not of songs to record or places to visit, but of names. Names that haunted him. Names that represented betrayal, humiliation, and broken trust. This was not Johnny Cash lashing out blindly. This was Johnny Cash confessing. He had spent his career singing about sin, redemption, and forgiveness, but when it came to these 7 musicians, forgiveness never came. They had cut too deep, and Cash wanted the world to know it before he left. Some of these men were expected. Public feuds everyone had heard about, but others were shocking names no one thought he'd ever hate. In the end, the list wasn't just about them. It was about him. About a man who built his legend on truth, refusing to die with lies on his lips. The first name on Johnny Cash's secret list was one that surprised even his closest friends, because on the surface, their relationship looked professional and cordial. But Cash never forgot how he was treated in his darkest days, and for him, respect was everything. Musician number 7 was Jerry Lee Lewis, the fireball of rock and roll and a man Cash once shared stages and studios with at Sun Records. To the world, they were part of the legendary $1 Million Quartet, but behind the cameras, the rivalry was vicious. Jerry Lee mocked Cash for his slower ballads, ridiculed him as the boring one of the group, and even boasted that Cash's music would never outlive rock and roll. Cash could take a joke, but what cut deepest were the moments when Jerry Lee insulted June Carter in front of others, sneering that she was the reason Cash's career was stumbling during his pill-fueled collapse in the late 1960s. To Cash, this wasn't just banter. It was humiliation delivered at a time when he was already battling for his life. And Cash never forgave him for it. Their paths crossed countless times over the years, at festivals, tribute shows, and award ceremonies, but Cash always kept a cold distance. Even when both men grew older and Jerry Lee softened his image. Cash could not erase the memory of being kicked while he was down. In interviews, Cash rarely mentioned Jerry Lee by name, but when pressed, he would say with that gravelly tone that some men never learned the meaning of loyalty. Privately, he told friends that Jerry Lee was a snake in the grass, a man who thrived on chaos and cruelty. And Cash did not want to leave this world without naming him as one of the few musicians he despised. For Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis symbolized everything he hated about the music industry: arrogance, disrespect, and betrayal disguised as friendship. The next name on Cash's list was one he spoke of with bitterness even in his final interviews, though he rarely mentioned him directly. Musician number 6 was Merle Haggard, a man Cash helped lift into the spotlight only to feel betrayed by later. Their story began with respect. Cash admired Haggard's raw honesty and even gave him one of his first national television appearances. But over time, what started as admiration turned into rivalry. Haggard mocked Cash's television show for being too polished, telling others that Cash had traded his outlaw soul for mainstream fame. The words stung because Cash had fought tooth and nail to get that platform, using it to showcase prisoners, poets, and musicians who never would have been seen otherwise. Worse, when Cash's health collapsed in the late 1980s, Haggard publicly called him washed up, saying that country music had passed him by. For a man who gave Haggard his first real chance, this was betrayal of the highest order. Cash carried the wound quietly, never lashing out in public, but storing the anger inside. He told June and close friends that Haggard was ungrateful and jealous, a man who pretended to be outlaw while stabbing others in the back. When the two men crossed paths backstage in the 90s, Cash greeted him politely, but with cold eyes, refusing to let him close. By the time Cash made his list at 71, Haggard's name was etched in with fury. For him, Haggard represented ingratitude, the kind of friend who smiles in your face but twists the knife when the spotlight shifts. Cash had endured humiliation from rivals before, but what burned most was betrayal from someone he had once considered a kindred spirit. To the world, Merle Haggard and Johnny Cash were legends side by side. To Johnny Cash alone, Merle was a reminder that even those you help can turn against you when envy takes root. The fifth name on Johnny Cash's hate list shocked many, because it was someone he had once collaborated with and even admired early in his career. That name was Waylon Jennings, the outlaw country rebel whose rough edge seemed to mirror Cash's own. To fans, they were brothers in arms, men who carved their own path against Nashville's polished machine. But beneath the surface was tension that never healed. Cash respected Waylon's talent, but despised his arrogance. Waylon often bragged that he was tougher, more authentic, and more outlaw than Cash could ever be, dismissing Johnny's battles with addiction as weakness. What hurt even more was the way Waylon mocked Cash's religious faith. During Cash's spiritual rebirth in the 1970s, Waylon sneered at him backstage, saying he'd sold out to Jesus just to keep fans forgiving him. Cash laughed in public, but in private, he burned with fury. He considered faith sacred, not a marketing trick, and he never forgot the insult. The rift widened when Waylon criticized June Carter, claiming she softened Cash and ruined his outlaw image. For Johnny, no insult cut deeper. Waylon also dismissed Cash's late career resurgence under Rick Rubin, calling it a gimmick and insisting Cash was clinging to youth. Cash, frail but proud, knew he was singing his truth in those final recordings, not chasing fame. To hear Jennings belittle it was unforgivable. By the end of his life, Cash admitted to friends that Waylon was a man he could never trust, someone who wrapped himself in outlaw pride while betraying the loyalty of those around him. Their friendship had been an illusion, Cash felt, a stage act that hid jealousy and contempt. To Cash Waylon, Jennings was not just a rival. He was a man who crossed lines no true friend should ever cross, and that placed him firmly on the list of 7. When Johnny Cash's list reached the middle, it carried 2 names bound together by the same kind of betrayal. The 4th was Buck Owens, the Bakersfield star who revolutionized country with his twangy sound, but who, in Cash's eyes, embodied greed and ego. Their paths crossed often on television specials and at the Opry, but Cash never forgave Buck for mocking him publicly during his years of addiction. Owens told reporters that Cash was a ghost of the man he used to be, a cruel jab at a time when Cash was fighting to reclaim his health and reputation. For Cash, this was not criticism. It was humiliation broadcast for the world to hear. He felt Owens was the kind of man who kicked others down just to climb higher himself. And that arrogance kept his name alive in Cash's memory as an enemy. The 3rd name was a shock to some, Kristofferson. Though Cash helped launch Chris's career by recording Sunday Mornin' Comin' Down, the relationship soured as years passed. Cash grew resentful of Kristofferson's political posturing and his offhand jokes about Cash's faith and frailty. During a recording session in the 1980s, Chris quipped that Cash was living on past glory, a remark Cash never forgave. To a man who had offered him a stage and defended him against Nashville gatekeepers, it felt like betrayal. Even worse was the growing rumor Cash heard that Chris, behind closed doors, claimed he had carried Cash into relevance, not the other way around. Whether true or not, the sting was enough to cement him on the list. To Cash, Owens and Kristofferson represented 2 sides of the same wound. One, the arrogance of public ridicule; the other, the sting of private betrayal by someone he had helped. Together, they stood as reminders that in the music business, loyalty could be bought, friendship could be faked, and respect could be shattered with a single careless word. Near the very top of Johnny Cash's list sat a name that few expected because for years, the 2 men appeared to share respect in public. Musician number 2 was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll himself. To the world, they were brothers from the Sun Records days, pioneers who reshaped music side by side. But behind closed doors, Cash carried resentment that never healed. In the early years, Elvis overshadowed everyone, and though Cash respected his talent, he grew tired of Presley's arrogance and the way he ignored old friends once he reached superstardom. Cash once confided to June that Elvis forgot where he came from, surrounding himself with yes men and shutting out those who had walked the same road from Memphis poverty to fame. The wound deepened in the 1970s when Elvis refused to join Cash in a charity performance for prisoners, brushing him off with an excuse that Cash knew was hollow. For a man who had built his career on giving voice to the forgotten, this felt like betrayal of principle. What stung even more was hearing through the grapevine that Elvis mocked Cash's gospel obsession, dismissing it as boring church songs. Elvis's private ridicule of his faith, combined with his neglect of old bonds, carved a permanent scar. Cash never said it outright in interviews, but in letters to friends he admitted that Elvis symbolized disappointment, that even legends could lose their soul to fame. By the time Cash's health collapsed in the 1990s, he no longer saw Elvis as a brother in music, but as a cautionary tale of excess and abandonment. For Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley was not just the king, he was a man who forgot loyalty, mocked faith, and left a friend behind. That was enough to earn him a place as number 2 on the list of 7 men Cash hated most. At the very top of Johnny Cash's list stood the name that shocked those who later heard whispers of it. A name no one thought would be there because the two men had shared stages, songs, and even moments of apparent brotherhood. The number 1 musician Johnny Cash hated most was Hank Williams Jr. To the public, Cash was seen as a father figure to younger outlaws like Hank Jr., a man who paved the way for their rebellious streaks to flourish. But behind the scenes, Cash saw in Hank Jr. a level of arrogance, disrespect, and cruelty that cut deeper than all the others. Their feud began quietly in the 1970s when Cash invited Hank Jr. onto his television show, giving him the chance to perform in front of millions. At first there was warmth, but it did not last. Hank Jr. often mocked Cash behind his back, calling him Old Man Black, and claiming that Cash's outlaw image was fake compared to his own. These comments spread quickly in Nashville, and they infuriated Cash because they were not just jabs at his career. They were attacks on his very identity. Johnny Cash never pretended to be an outlaw to win fans. He lived it, survived it, and paid for it with broken health and broken bones. To hear Hank Jr. belittle that life was unforgivable. The tension grew worse in the 1980s when Cash tried to mentor younger artists and emphasize the importance of humility. Hank Jr. rejected the advice, sneering that Cash's time had passed, and that country music now belonged to men who could fill stadiums with rowdy anthems. Cash, who valued storytelling and sincerity above all, saw this as a betrayal of everything he believed music should stand for. He began to speak less kindly of Hank Jr., in private describing him as all hat no cattle, a man who inherited a legacy from his father but never respected it. The worst insult came when Hank Jr. was quoted in an interview saying that Johnny Cash was too soft to ever be a real outlaw, claiming that Cash's faith and family ties kept him tame. To Cash, whose battles with addiction arrests and near-death experiences were scars he carried to his grave, those words were a knife twisting into an old wound. He had lost friends to drugs, nearly lost June to his destructive ways, and risked his life countless times on the road. And here was Hank Jr., a man who had grown rich off his father's name, questioning his authenticity. That insult Cash never forgave. By the late 1990s, when Cash was frail and often bedridden, he reflected on the men who had shaped his journey. Jerry Lee with his cruelty, Haggard with his ingratitude, Waylon with his arrogance, Owens and Kristofferson with their betrayals, Elvis with his abandonment, all had cut him, but none of them compared to Hank Williams Jr. For Cash, Hank Jr. represented the new face of country music that mocked the old, a face that turned its back on loyalty and truth in favor of ego and spectacle. Cash had given his life to music, worn his pain like armor, and opened his heart to his fans with brutal honesty. To be dismissed as too soft by a man who built his fame on another's legacy was the greatest insult of all. In his final years, Cash was clear to those closest to him. Hank Williams Jr. was the man he despised above all others, the name that burned brightest on the list. It was not simply personal anger, it was a statement. By naming Hank Jr. his greatest enemy, Cash was drawing a line in the sand between the kind of music he lived for and the kind he feared was taking over. To him, Hank Jr. was not just an arrogant musician, but a symbol of everything wrong with the industry, shallow, self-serving, and ungrateful to those who came before. And so, when Johnny Cash left behind the 7 names, the last and most venomous was Hank Williams Jr., the one man he wanted the world to know he hated most, even in the shadow of death. When Johnny Cash finally laid down his pen and sealed the list of 7 names, the weight of his confession rippled far beyond the walls of his room. It was not simply bitterness from an old man staring at death. It was the final honesty of a life that had been built on truth. Cash had never been afraid to expose his scars, whether it was singing about prisons while battling his own demons, or standing on stage half-broken and still giving every ounce of soul he had left. To leave this world without naming the men who cut him deepest would have been a lie, and Johnny Cash refused to die with lies on his lips. For fans who adored him as the Man in Black, the revelation of his hate list was both shocking and humanizing. They saw that even the voice of redemption carried grudges too heavy to let go. In Jerry Lee Lewis, he saw cruelty disguised as talent. In Merle Haggard, ingratitude from a man he lifted. In Waylon Jennings, arrogance that mocked faith. In Buck Owens, the ego that ridiculed him when he was down. In Kris Kristofferson, betrayal from a protege. In Elvis Presley, abandonment from a brother who lost his way. And in Hank Williams Jr., the living embodiment of everything Cash feared about the new generation of country. Ego over substance, fame over truth, arrogance over humility. To Cash, these men were not just rivals, they were symbols, each one representing a scar that never healed. Yet even as he confessed his hatred, Cash's legacy was not destroyed. It was amplified. His honesty gave weight to his music in a way no marketing ever could. Songs like Hurt suddenly carried more than pain. They carried confession. His quivering voice on those American Recordings albums sounded like a man who had carried grudges to the grave, but still chose to sing about grace. That contradiction, that tension, is what made Johnny Cash immortal. He was not a saint, he was not a preacher. He was a man, broken, bitter, redeemed, and unrepentant all at once. And that humanity is why his songs continue to echo long after his death. Those who were close to him said that in his last days he did not regret naming the 7. He believed the truth must be told no matter how dark, and he felt peace knowing he had unburdened himself before death took him. June stood by his side, understanding that the man she loved could carry both love and hate in equal measure. The world may never know every detail of the list, nor every reason behind each name. But the fact that it existed proves that Cash's life was never about perfection. It was about honesty. In the end, Johnny Cash's legacy is not defined by the men he hated, but by the courage it took to admit it. Because when the Man in Black looked at the world for the final time, he wanted his truth to be louder than silence. He wanted the record to show that even legends bleed, even icons carry bitterness, and even the most faithful can still burn with anger. That is why his songs still matter. They are not the voice of an untouchable hero, but the cry of a flawed man who never stopped telling the truth. And as his voice fades into history, the lesson remains. Redemption is real, forgiveness is possible, but honesty is eternal. Johnny Cash left the world with his music and his confessions, and in doing so, he reminded us all that the truth, no matter how hard, is the only thing worth leaving behind.